welcome to this edition of the Modern Japan History Association's New Books on Japan series. And today we're thrilled to have with us as our presenter, Jessamyn Abel, who is College of Liberal Arts Endowed Fellow and Associate Professor in the Asian Studies Department and affiliated faculty of the School of International Affairs at Pennsylvania State University. Professor Abel is a historian of modern Japan with interests in democratization, technology, infrastructure, sports, and international relations. And today she will be presenting on her most recently published book entitled Dream Super Express, A Cultural History of the World's First Bullet Train, which views the 1960s through the window of the Tōkaidō Shinkansen, the first bullet train, showing how infrastructure operates beyond its intended uses as a means of transportation to perform cultural and sociological functions. And we're very delighted to have Jess present on this book because her book was actually the inaugural winner of the Modern Japan History Association's book prize this year. She also has another book, her first book, which is entitled The International Minimum, Creativity and Contradiction in Japan's Global Engagement, 1933 to 1964, which examined the trans-war development of Japanese internationalism. And she's also published on a variety of other topics in journal articles, including on information society, the Olympics, cultural diplomacy, textbooks, and the history of whaling in the 19th and 20th centuries. And her next book project is focusing on post-war Japan to examine the role of public institutions in shaping democracy by promoting certain understandings of democratic thought and practice. So we're all looking forward to that someday in the future. And we are also very delighted to have with us as the interlocutor today, Yuting Dong, who is assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Chicago. Professor Dong works on the history of infrastructure, technology, labor, and expertise in Japan and East Asia more broadly. Her current book manuscript shows how Japanese colonial engineers and officials negotiated and engaged with Chinese laborers, brokers, and craftsmen in the building up of the urban landscape in Northeast China during the colonial period. Her work has already been published in a number of places, including Technology and Culture, Modern Asian Studies, and International Journal of Asian Studies. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Abel and Professor Dong to take us away with the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. So based on what Professor Abel and I discussed, I'm going to start by sharing part of my favorite part of the book. So I had the opportunity to listen to her kind of pre-book book talk once, and I was so excited by the topic, what she mentioned about, which now turned into a chapter 1. And when her book came out, I just immediately grabbed a copy. So today I'm going to start sharing the chapter that I feel personally benefited most for my own work. It's chapter 4, called Nostalgia for Imperial Japan. I like this book image as well. So there are many brilliant sentences, but I will just mention a few that I found most inspiring for my own research. She started the chapter by saying, while the new Tōkaidō line informed the competing visions of Japan's future, its shadow also extended back in time, inspiring a reimagination of wartime experience. And then she talked about juxtaposition of wartime descriptions and post-war memories of these two railway systems reveals the expansiveness, longevity, and durability of the aesthetic function of infrastructure, which can extend beyond its technical operation in both time and space. So from this part, she continued this chapter to talk about what I liked most is about how she tied the past with Japan's present, and how the present drew inspiration from the past, and how the present interpretation of the past actually shaped how Japan imagined itself in the future. So I think Professor Abel did a wonderful job in that chapter, talking about how Japanese intellectuals and the staff officials in the post-war period sought to build a continuity between wartime Japan, present Japan, and the future Japan. And it's my great opportunity to talk with her about her wonderful book in today's meeting. And I would like to start asking her to give a general roadmap of the book, about the argument, about the different other wonderful chapters. And I will hand the Zoom slot to Professor Abel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I guess I should have guessed that would be your favorite chapter. Just to give you, a quick overview, to the extent that I can do it quickly. So the title of the book, Dream Super Express, this phrase refers, of course, to the new Tōkaidō line. And when it opened, when it started running, it was the world's fastest regularly scheduled passenger train. And having that status as the world's fastest was very exciting. It really captured people's imaginations. And so both immediately afterward and on for decades, even today, it often is referred to as the symbol of Japan. And so I wanted to answer the question in this book, why the bullet train became such a powerful symbol. And I don't have a really clear, simple answer, but it's basically because people were able to fill it with meanings that mattered to them. So the bullet train embodied not only the nation, but also certain cities, communities, the self, in different ways for different people. So each chapter of the book considers the bullet train in the context of some important cultural trend in the cultural history of the 1960s and a little bit before and a little bit after. So for instance, the book begins in looking at some push and pull over the location of Kyoto Station. And so in that sense, it became part of the post-war struggle over the definition and the practice of democracy, and between local interests and national interests. And it became a struggle because initially Japanese National Railways, JNR, did not plan to stop in Kyoto. They thought they would zip right by it in the interests of time. And when Kyoto officials learned that the train was not going to be stopping in their city, they started a really intensive push to try to attract the bullet train as part of an ongoing, multifaceted effort to kind of rebrand what was famous as the ancient capital as not only the ancient capital, but also this modern, almost futuristic, what they called an international culture tourism city. But for people who were being evicted from their homes and businesses, or who had the tracks running over their homes, the bullet train was a symbol not of progress and prosperity, but rather of their continued powerlessness within the democratic system that had recently been established in Japan. And so their protests against the train, though they were largely unsuccessful, were part of the trend toward issue-specific citizens movements that were emerging at the time and over subsequent decades took on greater strength. Then each chapter kind of expands outward geographically a bit. So the next looks at Tōkaidō region as a whole. And this chapter considers the impact of the anticipation and the early use of the bullet train on ideas of space. So one element of that is that Tokyo and Osaka, which had been considered kind of distant cities from each other, felt closer. People felt closer to the residents of that other city. And the region as a whole felt smaller. People talked about it as becoming a single megalopolis instead of a number of smaller cities. So that was one way in which the bullet train changed space. In addition, new stations and platforms and tracks destroyed existing spaces, but they also prompted new uses of space. So for example, you can see today around Tokyo Station, under the bullet train tracks, there are all these great little bars and restaurants. And so that created a new way of using those spaces. in addition, in places where the bullet train station was built in a new place, it changed the shape of cities. So for instance, Yokohama kind of stretched outward to contain this new space of Shin Yokohama Station. Again, expanding outward to the national level, the bullet train became part of what was at the time being identified as the informationization of the Japanese economy and Japanese society. And you can see this idea of the bullet train as part of informationization in claims of land planners, but also in popular culture. For instance, in this chapter, I consider a detective novel and an action film that both kind of focused on the ways the bullet train was used to convey information and create information and increase the value of information, etc. Expanding outward again to the East Asian region, your favorite chapter, Professor Don, we can see that the bullet train was also part of that 1960s rethinking of Japan's imperialist past. And you already gave a nice introduction of that one. So I won't talk too much more about that, except to say that the original bullet train, the Dangan Desha, as they referred to it, which was a line that was planned but never built during the war. Some elements of it were actually used for the bullet train that was built in the 1960s. And the last chapter goes global, and is focused on the ways that the bullet train featured in efforts of the Japanese government and other interests to project a new national identity through public diplomacy. And the main example of that is the 1964-65 New York World's Fair, where planners said, we want to use the Japanese pavilion at this World's Fair to eliminate what they called, and I'm going to put this in air quotes here because this was their words, the Fujiyama geisha image of Japan. And they wanted to sweep that away and replace it using well-respected technologies like the bullet train, like the fastest train in the world, to build respect and appreciation for Japanese technology and a sense of Japan as a source of valuable technology and industrial know-how and products. It didn't exactly work the way they wanted it, but such plans often don't. So that's kind of an overview of the book as a whole. The very last project kind of considers all these themes more or less in the present day.
Mhm. That's a wonderful overview, and I hope you have a chance to grab a book to look at all the chapters if you haven't. I take this chance as a kind of interview the author from the backstage. So now we know all the chapters and the richness of the description about the cultural history of Shinkansen. I want to take the opportunity to ask the original story of this research. How did you think about writing about Shinkansen, the bullet train as well? And also, like, why did you think cultural history is the perspective that you want to pursue the project? And largely, I want to know, like, how do you situate this project with the past, like your past project as a scholar and probably the future project that Nick just mentioned, or Professor Kapper just mentioned? Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, the origin story, it comes out of my previous research for my previous book. Actually, they had a chapter on the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. And while I was researching the Olympics, I kept seeing references to the bullet train because it started running just over a week before the opening ceremony of the Olympics. So everywhere I looked for the Olympics, I was also seeing stories about the bullet train. And there was just so much excitement about the train that I was a little perplexed because trains are an old technology, right? And it was still a train. And this is the jet age, even the space age kind of around the corner. And I wondered why people were so excited about the train. So this book was just an effort to kind of answer that big question of what's all the fuss about. And that question kind of led me to a cultural history of it, because there has been some work on the technology involved, the engineers who created it and how they did that, a lot of the politics of various aspects of it. And that was great, and it was really helpful, but it, especially thinking about the technology, showed me that it wasn't really brand new technology. It wasn't a huge technological leap. And so none of these quite answered the question of what was so exciting. And so that's when I realized I had to just see, well, what were people themselves actually excited about? Not what do I think is exciting, but what were they saying when they were expressing excitement? And so it was really about the culture. I realized the question I had was really about the culture surrounding the bullet train than any other aspect. So that was the reason for that cultural history approach. And so that origin story pretty much tells the tale of how it connects to my previous research, that I think there was about a paragraph about the bullet train in that first book. But yeah, so it came out of that. And then it is definitely connected to my new project insofar as I finished this book just at the beginning of the pandemic. So there was quite a large chunk of time when I had finished something, hadn't yet started anything new, and I couldn't go to Japan. And so I thought, oh, well, what can I do? And so I just kind of was like poking around on my computer to see what could I possibly start working on. And I realized that I still had this folder full of materials that I had collected at the Prang collection at the University of Maryland, when I thought I would do a chapter of the bullet train book on the immediate post-war and sort of the rebuilding of the train system. Ultimately, I realized that didn't really fit into the book. And so I set those materials aside and never even really fully explored them. And so I thought, oh, great, I'll just start reading this huge folder full of photographs that I had taken at the Prang quite some number of years before. And as I was reading through them, mainly it was all kinds of materials, but a lot of educational materials for railroad employees, training manuals, or kind of test taking guides, study guides for the exams to get into the JNR educational institutions. And so I found that in these types of materials, even if they were about engineering or electrification or some really technical subject, there was often a section in the beginning that explained, what is the purpose of this book? And they kept talking about, this is going to help build democracy in Japan. And I kind of went, what, really? Electrification of trains is going to help build democracy? Why? But then I kept seeing it again and again so often that I thought, okay, there's something going on here with democracy. And of course, it's the keyword of the day, right? Probably everyone in Japan is talking about democracy in one way or another if they want to make people listen to them. And so I thought, well, what does it mean that this huge employer is teaching a large segment of the population, this is how you should behave to be a democratic railroader? Tetsudojin. I'm trying to find a word that's not railway man, because some of them were women, small percentage, but some of them. So railroader. And I started thinking about other industries, other sectors that where you could see similar things, and I found, oh, this is actually quite common, but everybody had different ideas of what it meant to be a democratic whatever you are. And so I thought, let me examine this as a next book and see how the education about democracy coming from large institutions like the National Railway, like NHK, the PTA, the police, sports organizations, the fact that all of these, I call them the institutions of daily life, the institutions that you deal with on a daily basis, not necessarily for your education, but the place you're going to work, the means of getting to work, the radio you listen to as you're getting ready for your day. How does their interjection into the education of the Japanese people about democracy, how does that shape post-war Japanese democracy? That's my question for the next book that kind of comes out of this leftover part of the bullet train book. And so the result is that my first book was on diplomacy, and I initially approached the bullet train from a question of what does this do for Japan's international, in Japan's public diplomacy. And that did end up being one chapter of the book, but certainly not the entire book. And so my first book became one chapter in my second book, and now my second book is becoming one chapter in my third book, if it ever comes to be. It's I'm at that starting point now where it seems far away. But
yeah,
gosh,
that's
that was a long answer. I hope I answered all your questions there.
yeah, that's a wonderful answer. Like, I'm already looking forward for the railroaders version of democracy, and I mean, I believe it will come out really soon. Anyway, yeah, and it's a good strategy to learn how you kind of combine the several projects together. The one chapter approach is really effective. And then another thing, also as an early career scholar, I think that path to my third question about the organization of the book, because as you mentioned in the very beginning, when you talk about different chapters, you kind of depict the chapters proceed in a spatial way from Tōkaidō to Japan to Asia to international sphere. But that's not usually how historians think about framing a book. Usually we are so familiar with chronological order. And I feel there are more and more books these days kind of doing the different way of organizing a book. And I want to ask, how did you come up with, think this spiritual space, like a progression is a good way to organize a book? And have you encountered any challenge when organizing book in this way?
Yes, the whole question of how to organize it was itself a big challenge. I had that chapters in many different orders as time went by, and I tried to figure the whole thing out. The first chapter on Kyoto was actually the last one that I wrote, so I couldn't quite figure out the order of the chapters until the very end, because I wrote 3 chapters not knowing what the fourth and fifth, not being sure what the fourth and fifth were going to be, because I had a few possibilities and one didn't pan out, and I got some really good feedback for another one. And anyway, so I didn't have a chronological order when I organized, when I came up with the ideas. I mean, part of this has to do with the way I attacked the project, which is that I didn't really know what I wanted to write about. I didn't have kind of a bunch of topics or something like that, or some ideas about chapters. Instead, I just went and found everything I could find written on the bullet journal. And this is not a good way to start your research. I don't recommend it. But I just, copied everything I could find that was about the bullet train, went to the Diet Library and, spent days and days collecting journal articles and book chapters and the like, and just started reading and waited to see what themes popped out at me. And so by the time I got those themes down and had ideas for chapters, I realized, well, they all are more or less chronologically overlapping. So there was no obvious beginning to end. So I wasn't sure. So I initially tried, well, this one seems to start earlier and this one kind of ends the latest, so I'll put them roughly in that didn't work. And so I just kept trying until I felt there was kind of a smooth progression. And actually the penultimate order was chapter 5 through 1. So going from the globe to the region, to the nation, to Tōkaidō, to Kyoto. And I sent it in to the publisher, and the reviewers came back and said, it doesn't work in this order. You really have to know the things that are going on in Kyoto with the planning before you can understand the importance of what happened in New York with the public diplomacy. And I said, oh, wow, right. Actually, it would be much better in the reverse order. So I just flipped all the chapters, had to kind of rewrite all my chapter connections because they were going in the wrong direction. And then I was so happy when the book was reviewed by Ulrika Scheda, actually, who said, I really wish chapter 5 had come first. And I thought, oh, good, somebody else saw what I was doing there. But at any rate, it was a struggle to find an organization that made sense, that made for a smooth narrative in spite of there being really no chronological story to tell.
Yeah, wow, that's a really encouraging story, because it's the author kind of rise out of the process of doing research and see how things seem to pop up. That's a good way to start, I feel. Thank you for the good advice. And so my next question is actually about all the materials you collected from National Dialect Library. So one part I really love in this book is there are many, many wonderful images, and Professor Abel did a wonderful job to explain and kind of interpret the image and still her interpretation of the image to the larger story. I don't think we have enough time to go through image by image, even though I would really love that. Would you mind sharing us with one image you think you like most and you want to share with the group?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I will share one that I know is one of your favorites. This guy, Gamera, the giant monster. Yeah, I decided to share this one with you because it's not the most important image in the book, but it's the first image that I saw that I thought, oh, yes, this is something I want to talk about in the book. So the press said only 10 images. So I had to really be strict with myself because, of course, the bullet train is very photogenic. And there are, almost every publication, even newspaper articles, often included a picture of the train running. And so there's sort of an overabundance of visual material. And given that I could only choose 10, I had to be very strict with myself and make it count. So I said to myself, no images that are just illustrations, right? I'm not going to include any images unless it really can furthers the argument. So in that sense, the press's strict limit was very helpful in kind of disciplining my desire to just show a million pictures. Look at this cool picture I found. So the Gamera, somebody gave me this DVD and said, look, Gamera is holding a bullet train. This should be interesting to you. And it was. I watched the movie and I talked not only about the image, but the film as a whole in my book. But the reason this image itself interested me initially was this placement of the bullet train as one of several symbols, right? So why did the artist, I wondered, choose to include the bullet train here front and center, the thing that Gamera's in the midst of kind of grabbing and attacking just at that moment? Well, one reason is that it was popular, right? This movie came out, I think, just 1 year after the bullet train started running, so people were still very excited about it, and that's one of the reasons it shows up in a lot of popular culture, not just films and books, but also children's toys and all sorts of material doodads. So that's one reason, but also not only was it popular, but it really is here serving as a symbol, or having it here alongside the Diet building in the background you can see crumbled on the top there, and Tokyo Tower has been knocked over. So in a sense, this kind of representation helped maybe make it a symbol. So what I wondered, what is the bullet train along with these? It's a symbol of Japanese technology, of modern Japan, of certainly of Tokyo, in the case of the Tokyo Tower and the Diet Building. And so this image was rich enough, and the film itself said enough about the bullet train, even though it only shows up in one scene. It's really not a focus of the film. There was enough there to make it worth talking about in the book. And so after I saw this, and I yeah, found it useful to talk about, I just started, whenever I saw a cool image, I saved it, and thought about how it would work alongside the texts that I was using on that same topic. So I really tried to kind of think about it with the written materials, and if it didn't fit in, okay, that one's not going to make the top 10. And you know, in terms of finding such images, I was very lucky that the bullet train does show up in so much popular culture, because I just would come across them in looking at materials from the times. If I was looking at a magazine, sometimes there would be a photo essay included, right? And so suddenly I have all these, and one of those ended up in the book. Oh gosh, people post stuff online on their blogs, and I would just look at things that people had posted, or covers of historical materials I was looking at would have some nice image on the cover, often not of good enough quality to use in the book. So that was always a little disappointing if I couldn't find a nice quality image. But then, of course, films like this, there are a couple of other films that featured the bullet train, and they also have images that were useful for the analyses that I was making. Uh-oh, you're muted.
Oh, I said we can just keep the image on the screen. Yeah, it's now I read the chapter on this bullet train and this image. That's what I was really impressed at this time. But now I get to know more the methodology you analyze the image, because by juxtaposing, like I feel juxtaposition of image and written text, I'll compare two images is a method you use really often in your writing. Yeah, and because the chapter 4 also you juxtapose like the image of the Asia Express with other images. Is that I wonder, a follow-up question is, how do you use this kind of method to teach in your course on Japanese history, or just more generally, how do you think we can, as historians teaching in America, to students who largely have no knowledge about Japanese language, how do you use image in your teaching?
Yes, I use images a lot in my teaching. It is a good way to allow students who don't have the Japanese language. I mean, I almost never teach students who can read Japanese with any facility. So when they are trying to think of a research topic, it's very limited. And so something in translation, or, American perceptions of Japan, or, images, right? And so in the hopes that that will be helpful to them, I do kind of model that analysis of images as much as possible. I use for instance, the MIT Visualizing Cultures website I use a lot. But then also just, if it's something I've done research on, I do like to bring in some of my own materials. I think that helps students kind of understand that this is something you can just look at an image and read it. And I do try to teach them to look at it as any other primary source, like ask all those same questions about production and authorship and viewership, and try to get at the meanings in similar ways.
Yeah, definitely. A good image is more than 1,000 words, as
Yes.
the sentence always say. So we are moving fast, but I think then we can have more chance to talk about infrastructure studies in your work, because as the audience probably already know, this book won the MJHA first annual Booker Prize. And one part I feel the Dream Super Express was did pioneering work. It's including kind of incorporating the current studies on infrastructure into the discussion of Japanese history, into the writing of like bullet train culture history. And I just want to ask Professor Abel, how did you encounter infrastructure studies? Was, as you said, this in the beginning you were interested in bullet train, right, as a phenomena. How did you combine this idea, this fascination, or just kind of curiosity with bullet train to the really booming study of infrastructure history?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It actually was a very fortunate coincidence that I first encountered the work of infrastructure studies, which is that I submitted an article to the journal Positions. And because it's an interdisciplinary journal, one of the scary but also really helpful and potentially helpful things, wonderful things about it, is that they won't necessarily send it to another historian. And in fact, that's what happened. They sent it to somebody in anthropology who said, oh, well, how can this article not grapple with this whole scholarship on infrastructure? And I kind of went, oh, there's a scholarship on infrastructure. Uh-oh. But fortunately, this very generous reader suggested several articles that I could start with. And so I started with those for this particular article that ultimately got published maybe 5 years ago. And then, that was my first foray into trying to write about the bullet train. And so I was really lucky that I learned about this at a very early moment when I had just started working on it, because then I was able to read more and more and really integrate it into the book. And it made a huge difference for how I conceived of the book as a whole. For that first article, the most important element for me was that it gave me sort of an existing vocabulary to talk about what I was seeing in the bullet train, right? And so I was kind of struggling to explain things. And after reading the several articles that this reviewer suggested, I said, okay, there are words for this, right? I can just kind of use these explanations. And then that was helpful in terms of writing it, but sort of much bigger value of that was that it helped me emphasize, because this scholarship covers every country all over the world, anywhere, it helped me emphasize that this story is not about Japan specifically, but it's about high-speed rail, or generally about infrastructure anywhere, right? That these same kinds of phenomena, these same kinds of dynamics exist where any kind of infrastructure that you're looking at, you can find some aspect of it. And the comparison also, of course, helps identify specificity, because so in reading about all of these other examples, I kind of say, okay, well, what's particular about post-war Japan and this bullet train? And so it really helped me hone my ideas in that way. But if I could sort of turn things around, I would actually really like to hear your thoughts on this, since of course you are, I know, finishing up a manuscript on not just one infrastructure, but various infrastructures in the Japanese Empire. And so what I think is, I find it really exciting that you're sort of taking these similar ideas and pulling them over to the empire and sort of flipping them against the colonizer, and kind of looking at from the perspective of the colonized. And or maybe not the perspective, but the role of the colonized, right? And so I wanted to ask you, how do you find that infrastructure studies helps us understand that history of Japanese empire differently?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think as Professor Abel, I also didn't start my project with infrastructure studies. So when I started my project, I was more interested in urban architecture history, construction site, basically the buildings. And then when I started my field work in Japan, I encountered more resources about construction, how you build red brick houses, how you build like roads and dams and water filtration plant. And I think one of Professor Abel is one of the pioneers in spreading infrastructure studies in history, especially Japanese history, because I remember clearly when I was doing field work, you organized a workshop on infrastructure studies. Yeah, but I didn't apply for that because at that stage I just wrote one chapter. But I think starting from that point, there are more and more focus on infrastructure, especially in history. I feel in the beginning, it's mainly the anthropologists are researching infrastructure. So what I find infrastructure, because as you said, the terminology overlapped or mapped really well to what I saw on the ground. So what I see when I look at Japan's empire building in Manchuria is the materiality of infrastructure. So infrastructure was both a symbol but also a material artifact. So in my work, I focus more on the material artifact. So I look at how labor and how material was recruited and managed to build infrastructure. And when looking at those infrastructures through that angle, I get the chance to look more about interaction between engineers and local workers, which is not always present in the engineers' reports and like Japanese official archives. Or you have to look between cracks to see the interaction. So for me, I feel this infrastructure studies focus on both the infrastructure as a symbol, aesthetic, poetic symbol, political symbol, as well as a material aspect is really liberating for research. And also infrastructure, also the focus on infrastructure also overlaps with environmental history and history of science technology. And I got a lot of inspiration for my own research from all the three fields. Yeah, so the book is more as anything but railway. So the book will look at the railway, Montetsu, like the South Manchurian Railway in Manchuria from 1905 to late 1990s. But I focus more on the other urban infrastructure that the railway company started building instead of the railway itself. Yeah, and I mean, I'll take the chance to ask the last question from me, and then before we open up to the public, because this is a workshop for modern Japanese history, I want to ask Professor Abel, how do you think this focus on infrastructure contributes to the study of Japanese history, specifically our history of East Asia?
Well, I think it's very useful for studying Japan because it is such an important part of, well, maybe I only think this is because of what I study, but I feel like it's an important part of Japanese identity. The fact that and economy, right? So the Japanese government is today trying to promote export of bullet trains to other countries. So this is something that Japanese leaders feel today they can contribute to the world. And so in looking at the history of the bullet train, I feel like I can understand somehow how we got to that point that we're in today. So I think it's not the case that things that aren't ongoing aren't important, but I think for me, the role of infrastructure in Japan today makes it particularly interesting for me to look at.
Yeah, and Japan still build a lot of infrastructures, both inside Japan and abroad. Yeah,
they're trying, although I mean, there's the news about the maglev is still that it's stalled in Shizuoka. So I don't know. Apparently the governor who's been opposing it is not running again, and so I don't know. Maybe the next governor will be more open to it. We'll see.